Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And what we're going to talk about in this final section about the archaeology of Pompeii is the dead of Pompeii, the sinking of great ships, the fact that there are too many Roman men inside this city, and finally the sad story of the House of Polybius. We're going to follow that outline right up above me, and you're going to use this information to answer your question, to answer that big question about the archaeology of Pompeii. And let's go ahead and jump right into this final section. You have the account of Pliny the Younger. You have the stratigraphic sequence from across this buried Roman city. And finally, I'm going to tell you what exactly was found in each of these stratigraphic layers. And the answer to that is a lot of bodies. More than 1,000 bodies have been recovered from inside the buried Roman city itself. And of the dead of Pompeii, roughly 394 of them are found associated with that bottommost layer, with that layer of coarse ash as it settled across this Roman city. Most of these individuals, like the people we're going to meet in the House of Polybius, most of these individuals are either inside houses or they're sheltering against walls. They are inside these buildings, and they had to have perished before that thin middle layer forms, because they're buried and they die before that. And a lot of these individuals appear to have died from blunt force trauma to the head, which is generally from collapsing buildings. And the reason a lot of these buildings are falling down is because these are like little light Roman Mediterranean houses. They were never meant to carry the weight of 2 or 3, or in some cases, 4 meters of ash piling on top of these houses. And these little Roman houses just would implode from the weight of all of this ash stacked on top of it. And some of these people attempted to kind of shelter in place into their homes. They were buried by this ash, and their houses collapsed. And the collapse of their houses apparently killed a lot of these individuals. And if you look at this map right up above me, you'll see these numbers and these little dots. Each of those dots is the location of one of the bodies they've found associated with this lower layer. And each of the circles with numbers in it is a group of people that were found inside one of the structures. And you can see they're pretty evenly scattered across the city. There's one group of 13 that kind of made the very bad decision to kind of shelter in their home. There's another group of 12, but you see in other homes, it's completely empty. In some of these homes, there's no bodies found at all. So I want you to ask yourself that question. Why in one house do we have 12 people, entire families, that decided to stay in place, shelter in place, and died buried in the collapse of their own home? And right next door, you have this house that's completely empty. There's nobody in that house at all. What was the difference that ensured that people in one house lived and escaped, and people in another house stayed and perished? What was the decision that saved one family and doomed the other? Now we're going to get associated with that middlemost layer. Remember that it's this thin, dark middle layer that is associated with the tops of broken architecture, like something came along with a big fist and just smashed across the city and knocked over all these buildings. So 650 bodies were associated with this middle layer. And most of these individuals are found outside of their homes. These people are found in the streets. They're found lying huddled in the gutter. They are found inside gardens with large group of people huddled together. They are found on staircases. And basically, these bodies are found outside. They are either buried in the middle layer, just above it, or just below it. So they must have died when that thin middle layer was established. And there's at least 650 of these individuals associated with that thin middle layer. And some of these skeletons show a great deal of violence and excessive temperatures. So something very traumatic happened to these individuals who were caught outside when that middle layer formed. And again, you can see this map. This is a map of those individuals that were sort of associated with that middle layer. You can see how they're distributed across the city. Each of the black dots is where one of these individuals were. But you can see, in contrast to the previous layer, there's whole groups that are scattered, and there are whole groups that are concentrated, and they're concentrated near the city gates. Find the new Syrian gate. That's where the Garden of the Fugitives was. Look, there's another group, 37. A group of 37 bodies were found there associated with the middle layer next to one of these gates, also next to the theater. So these middle layers, they're not evenly distributed across the city. Most of these 650 people are clustered together in gardens or in sheds next to the city walls. And that should raise another question. Why are these people clustered together? What are these people doing outside of their homes? And why did they apparently walk up to these gates, stop, and then just kind of cluster with people next to the gates? Why didn't they go through the city gates? Or maybe, why couldn't they go through the city gates? And finally, what killed them all at the same time? Garden of the Fugitives. That's one of those clusters of bodies that accumulated, one of these piles of bodies associated with inside the city next to the new Syrian gate. But this raises something really interesting about the dead of Pompeii. So far, there have only been about 1,000 bodies recovered. Now, let's just assume there's 1,000 more somewhere that haven't been found, either just outside of the city or in one of the unexcavated portions of the city. But even if you double the dead of Pompeii, you only get to 2, or even if you triple the known dead from Pompeii, you only get about 3,000 people. But we know from Roman records how many people lived at Pompeii. We know this because there was this, about 8 or 9 years before the eruption, there was actually a big urban riot in Pompeii. It had to do with this gladiatorial match where it was really obvious that the favored champion threw the match. It was fixed. So basically all the people who'd bet money on the town champion winning the gladiator fight rioted because they'd been gypped by the mob. There was still a mob, still an Italian mob in the 1st century AD. So anyway, they riot and the Roman army's got to come in to suppress the riot. And one of the things they say is that all 10,000 people of the city took to the streets. So that tells us that the population of Pompeii was at least 10,000 people. So there's at least 10,000 Romans living in Pompeii. But only 1,000 bodies have been found. And even if we double or triple the dead from Pompeii, at most, only about 3,000 people probably died in this disaster. What does that tell us about the survivability of Pompeii itself? Somewhere around 70 to 90% of the people of Pompeii apparently survived the disaster. Why did so many people survive and so few people die? And what decision did those people make that saved their lives? And what decision did those people make that ended them? Think back to Pliny the Younger's account. And the other thing about the dead of Pompeii is it's not equal demographically. We're going to look at the men and the women and the young and the old and the children from the analysis of the osteology from the dead of Pompeii. And it's not a perfect reflection of Roman society. We're going to get to that in just a bit because there's too many men. And that's going to tell us something about what's going on in the final days of Pompeii. But before we get to that, I want to talk about how mortality rates reflect different disaster situations. And to do that, we're going to move from southern Italy to the North Atlantic. And we're going to talk about two sinkings of 2 very famous ships. There on the left, that's a ship you've probably heard of. That is the Titanic, which of course famously sank in 1912. And of course there, right above my yellow box on the right, that is the Lusitania, which was torpedoed and sank in the First World War. And both boats are very interesting. And both boats, even though the boats were almost identical, have very different mortality statistics. Let's start with the Titanic. The Titanic, of course, very famously, in an attempt to escape from Celine Dion's song, the ship rams an iceberg, cripples, sinks by bow first. The ship sinks over about 3 hours, which is the perfect time to make a movie about it. So the Titanic sinks in about 3 hours. The ship sinks very, very slowly. Most famously, there were not enough lifeboats for everyone. And this is reflected in the mortality statistics of the Titanic. Basically, of the, these are, I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head. These are rough estimates. But basically, of the women and children on the Titanic, roughly 80% of the women on the Titanic survived. They made it to the boats. Almost 100% of the children on the Titanic survived. So if you were a woman on the Titanic, your chances of surviving that sinking were very, very good. If you were a woman. But not if you were a man. If you were a man on the Titanic, your chances of surviving were very low. Only about 20% of the men on board the Titanic survived. And even though most of these men that did survive were basically crew members that had to man the boats that were being filled with women and children. So think about this. Why did so many men on the Titanic die while so many women and children survived? What about the very slow sinking of the ship enabled this choice to be made? Think about that. Now, the sinking of the Lusitania, the Titanic's sister ship, could not have been different. The Lusitania is, again, one of these big liners. And the Lusitania sinks in 1915 off the southern coast of Ireland, where it is torpedoed by a German U-boat. The torpedo strikes it in the bow, explodes, the ship begins to tilt, and this is followed by a massive secondary explosion in the center of the ship. The Lusitania was almost certainly carrying war materials, even though it wasn't supposed to. It was almost certainly carrying war materials to help the British war effort in the First World War. So there's this massive secondary explosion, and basically the ship, the Lusitania, dives bow first straight into the North Atlantic. It took the Titanic about 3 hours to sink. The Lusitania goes down in 15 minutes. All right. It goes down straight by the bow. The engines are still turning as the entire ship goes down. There was not time to launch almost any lifeboats from the Lusitania. Everyone in broad daylight, it was broad daylight, but everyone went into the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. Men, women, children, they all go into the water. Ship is gone. And everyone is bobbing in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. And no one is told to come save them because, I mean, there's a German U-boat in the area. The only reason anyone survived on the Lusitania is the fact that there are these absolutely fearless Irish fishermen had watched the ship sink. They had watched the ship get hit. They knew that there was a German U-boat in the area, and these Irish fishermen, against the orders of the Royal Navy, made the decision to go save the people on the Lusitania. So they head out there in their little fishing boats, and they know there's a German warship in the area. It's a German U-boat. And it takes them about 40 minutes to get to the site of the sinking, to start pulling people out of the water. But being in that water for 40 minutes to an hour took its toll, and the mortality statistics of the Lusitania reflect this toll. So what are those grim mortality statistics? They are, in fact, a complete mirror to the mortality statistics on the Titanic. If you were a woman on board the Lusitania, your chances of surviving were very, very small. Only about 20% of the women who went into the Atlantic on board the Lusitania survived. Most of the women who went into the water perished. 80% of them perished. Of the children, there weren't very many children on board the Lusitania. But of the little kids that went into the water, all of them died, 100% mortality. But the men who jumped into the water and had to kind of tread water until these like incredibly fearless fishermen came to rescue them, almost 80% of the men survived. So again, here's my question to you. Why did so many men survive on the Lusitania and die on the Titanic? But this is reversed. Why did so many women die in the sinking of the Lusitania, but survive the sinking of the Titanic? And I'm basically going to tell you. Basically, in the Titanic, they had the amount of time to make cultural decisions. They decided women and children first. They made the decision to save all of the women and children at the expense of the men. And they upheld this cultural aesthetic that was possessed by these Edwardians, by the people, in 1912. They didn't have that luxury on the Lusitania. Everyone went into the water. Everyone had to tread water in the open Atlantic until those Irish fishermen arrived. And basically, that's one of the things that determined whether you lived or whether you died. Can you tread water? Can you tread water in the freezing ocean until you're saved? And a lot of the men could do it, and a lot of the women could not. And this is, of course, hampered by the clothing of the day. Big dresses, high-laced boots, clothing not really suited to swimming in the North Atlantic. And probably a lot of the women, their clothes got soaked, they got very exhausted, and they sank. So here's the question I'm applying this because I want you to think about when we get to the mortality statistics of Pompeii. Do the dead of Pompeii most closely match the Lusitania, where they didn't have time to make these decisions? Or does it match the Titanic, where they had time to make decisions, and the decisions they made determined who lived and who died? And that is how the demographics of these two sinking boats is reflected, how the mortality statistics reflects the differential behaviors you see on these two ships. And when we get to the dead of Pompeii, it's going to reflect these same kind of decisions. Did they have time to make a decision? And what kind of decisions were made? And you have to incorporate these decisions when you reconstruct the final events of Pompeii. Now, this data comes from an absolutely fabulous book called Resurrecting Pompeii by a great osteologist named Emile Lazar. And there she is right up above, not even pausing. This is how much of a scientist she is. She doesn't even pause for the camera. She's like, no, there's science to be done. So there she is, sciencing away. And what she did is absolutely amazing. And this book is just absolutely incredible. She basically sits down with every known skeleton that has ever been recovered from Pompeii. Recovered in the 21st century, recovered in the 20th century, recovered by Giuseppe Fiorelli, recovered going all the way back to King Charles VII of the House of Bourbon. And she says, okay, let's look at biological sex, let's look at age, and let's resurrect the people of Pompeii. Let's see how many men are among the dead, how many women, how many elderly, how many little kids. And it's not what you expect. What you should expect is roughly equal numbers of women and men, with a slight edge to the women, because, men tend to die younger. There should be a large number of children, and there should be a very few number of elderly people, because this is imperial Rome, and life was kind of rough. So that's what you should see. You should see this almost even distribution of biological sex. You should see a bottom-heavy distribution of, there should be way more young people than there are elderly. And that's not what Dr. Lazar discovered at all. It's such a good book. This is what she discovered. There are way too many men. Of the dead of Pompeii, roughly between 58 and 64% of them are male. And there's a wiggle room because this is using different indicators of biological sex. Probably the upper number is probably the more accurate. So basically almost 2/3 of all the dead of Pompeii are male. And most of these people are adult male. They're between 20 and 60 years of age. So there's way too many men at Pompeii. All right. There are women at Pompeii. There's way too few. There should be basically 50, 52, 53% of females at Pompeii, and there's not. There's between 36 and 41%. There are too few women. There are too many men. And remember, you should see a lot of, in what is expected of a normal population demographic from Roman society, there should be a lot of kids and a few elderly. That's, again, not what we see at Pompeii. There are almost no children at Pompeii. Of those 1,000 bodies that have been studied, there's less than 2% of these people are kids. That number should be way higher. That number should be, 15, 20, 25%. It's not. It's 1.62% infants, juveniles, and adolescents. There are almost no children among the dead of Pompeii. And the elderly, there's almost no elderly people who are dead at Pompeii. The elderly people above 60 years of age are 8.3% of the analyzed dead of Pompeii. Way too few old people. What's going on? I want you to think about this, cogitate, and explain these differential mortality statistics and put that answer in your reconstruction. So there are very few juveniles, there's very few infants, in fact, there's almost none. There's very few old people, and there's a lot of adult men, and there's not enough women. Does these mortality statistics, does it more look like the Titanic or the Lusitania? Did they have time to make decisions that reflect cultural aesthetics? I want you in your answer to explain why we have so many adult men dead inside the buried city of Pompeii. Now, we're going to go to the House of Polybius. We've talked about, the people that have died inside houses, and what layer they're associated with. We've talked about the people that died in the streets and what layer they're associated with. There are no dead bodies associated with the topmost layer. That's actually I should have mentioned that earlier. Now we've talked about these big broad things, and now we're going to boil it down to a single incident. I'm going to tell you the sad story that was uncovered when archaeologists excavated the House of Polybius. And the House of Polybius is on the Street of Abundance, and it is located right there. Okay? Now, I believe they excavated the House of Polybius in the 1970s and into the 1980s. And the thing is that they actually knew who Polybius was, for a long time. Because right before the eruption happened, there was apparently about to be an election. They were going to have an election inside the city of Pompeii. Rome was still an empire, but at the city level, it still operated as a democracy. So there was about to be this election at Pompeii, and they were electing the master of ceremonies. And this was an important society this was an important position within Roman cities. Your master of ceremonies is the person who basically organizes religious festivals. So basically there's going to be a big, festival for Juno or a big festival for Jupiter. And this person is going to go to all the rich people in the city and collect money. He's going to make sure that there's musicians, make sure there's food, make sure there's dancing. And so it's actually a really important position because it's a position that you can lever and get like really lucrative city contracts. And Polybius was apparently running for this office. And we know Polybius was running for this office because there's this graffiti all over Pompeii arguing, "You vote for Polybius, he bakes the best bread." That was apparently his campaign slogan, if I remember correctly. So there's a lot of graffiti arguing that you should vote for Polybius. Polybius is a good guy. He's a successful local businessman. He came up from nothing. He's a good guy. Vote for him for master of ceremonies for the city of Pompeii. Of course, the elections were never held because the city was destroyed. And, during the 19th century and into the 20th century, they just knew that, Polybius was this local baker who became, who wanted to get into politics. But they didn't actually ever expect to find his house or him. But they did. This is the House of Polybius. This is what the House of Polybius looked like. The Romans were not into lawns. All right, they weren't, as you can see, they weren't into porches. Basically, these Roman houses go right up to the street. They start right on the sidewalk. Basically, the public outside of your house looks like that. It's just a wall. But inside your house, that's where you put all your greenery. There's the atrium. It's really pretty. That's where you put your well and your water and your rain catchment system and all this good stuff. And when they started excavating this house, one of the things that they recognized is there had apparently been some kind of campaign meeting where Polybius had met with like a lot of the people that were trying to get him elected. Because inside one of the rooms, there was all these like campaign, like all this graffiti painted on the wall talking about like how great Polybius was. So this was the House of Polybius. And they were very excited because it's actually one of the nicer and bigger houses inside Pompeii itself. And again, Polybius wasn't a general. He wasn't a war hero. You know, he wasn't a senator or anything. He was basically just a really, really successful local businessman. He owned a bunch of bakeries. In fact, he owned the biggest bakery in Pompeii, a structure that has become known as the House of the Chaste Lovers. And they excavated the House of Polybius. And this is what they found. That's some of that pro-Polybius graffiti right up above it. I can't read it. I can't read Latin anyway. And basically they worked out what had happened inside the House of Polybius. And you have right here the sequence of events. That basically what happened with A is, here's the House of Polybius. All of this ash starts to fall from the sky. And it's accumulating on the roof and on the top of the House of Polybius. And it's falling off of the sloped roof, and it's falling into the courtyards, into the atriums. So basically, in the House of Polybius, you can see right there, basically the courtyards, that courtyard you just saw, and inside the open spaces of Pompeii, these began to rapidly accumulate, meter after meter after meter of ash, start to fill up the exterior portions of the house. And as you can see, they go right up to the eave. They would have blocked doors. They would have covered walls. They would have poured down into hallways. And the weight of some of that ash, when it started accumulating on the roof itself, caused the forward portion of the house to collapse. And you can see that in diagram B. The front part of the House of Polybius actually crashes inside. Because again, you know, these little light Roman houses, they're not meant to hold, you know, 2 or 3 meters of ash on top. The weight of that ash is going to push through the roof of the house. So part of the House of Polybius has already started to collapse. And then C, and this should be really obvious, something really huge and massive strikes the house from the north. The House of Polybius faces south. And it strikes from the north and it rips away the entire upper floor. Most of the upper floor is ripped away, and it basically just continues to bury whatever is left, and it leaves this thin middle layer on top of all that smashed architecture, whatever that depositional event could have been. And I really hope by now you've figured out what it was. And if anybody was alive in the House of Polybius at this point, when C comes around, that's it, they're dead. No one is going to survive the depositional event that is depicted in diagram C. And the house was empty, except for rooms GG and rooms HH. Now we're going to go into a top-down plan view. There's the House of Polybius. You can see that it's north is the top of the map, south is the bottom of the map, and remember the house is south-facing. So at the bottom of the map, that's where the Street of Abundance would be. So the southern part of the structure is where they would have all lived. You can see there's the open courtyards. But the most secure part of the house with the strongest architecture, the part of the house with the thickest walls and the strongest roof, is actually in the back of the house, room GG and room HH. These are the thickest parts of the house. They're the most secure parts of the house. They're the parts of the house with the biggest, thickest doors. And that's where they found the bodies. Room GG and room HH. The family of Polybius. 4 skeletons were found in the room marked GG. And I want you to note how the ash is very loose, how the bodies are lying on top of this coarse ash. And therefore the ash has already started to fill the room before these people perished. 8 skeletons were found in room HH. And altogether of these 12 individuals, there were 3 adult men, 3 adult females, 4 boys, and 1 female who was a late adolescent. She was between 16 and 18 years of age. She was in the middle of her 3rd trimester of pregnancy. When her skeleton was found, the skeleton of the fetus was in her abdomen, and they can date the skeleton. And she was very, very, very pregnant. In fact, she was about to give birth. Now, I believe they did a genetic analysis, and they determined that all three of the men were related, and they were related to the fetus, but none of the females were. So what we're probably looking at is Polybius, his sons, and all of their wives. And here is, there is another drawing of the bodies from the House of Polybius. Almost all of these rooms were filled with coarse ash. But the coarse ash had already begun to accumulate in the rooms before these individuals died. Now, if you look at that individual kind of splayed out on top of the ash, you can quite clearly see that there's almost a half meter of ash is filling this room up when that individual finally perished. And they weren't found lying on top of ash. The ash actually, if I remember correctly, even after they died, continued to fill the entire room long before the event that came along and smashed the forward portion of the structure. And there is the poor pregnant female. She was lying on the one piece of furniture that was found in the room. It was this little divan. She was in her third trimester of pregnancy, and one of those adult men was the father. So it's either Polybius's child or Polybius's grandchild. And that's where her body was found, and that's where the fetus was found, on this divan. The young pregnant woman lying on this couch in room HH. So here's the question I want you to ask. I've given you all this information about the House of Polybius. I want you to think about what's going on in the House of Polybius. Why did these people make the decision to stay? Why did they make the decision to go into these two rooms in the back of their house? And why did they decide to stay there? Why didn't they leave? Or even, could they even have left if they wanted to? Why did they make the decision to stay when so many other made the decision to leave? And finally, I want you to make a narrative. What happened in the House of Polybius each of the days of the eruption as defined by Pliny the Younger and the stratigraphic evidence? You now have all the pieces you need. You have all the evidence to build a day-by-day account of what happened inside the city of Pompeii. I want you to use the archaeological evidence, the accounts of Pliny the Younger, the dead of Pompeii, everything you know about mortality statistics, everything you know about stratigraphy, and give me a reconstruction of the final events of Pompeii. What happened at each stage of the eruption? I want you to build a narrative, and it's got to be a way, way better narrative than Bulwer-Lytton built. You don't have to include Blind Nydia if you don't want to. Please don't, unless you've got a really good reason. But unlike Bulwer-Lytton, you actually have to give distinct evidence to back your reconstruction of events. First, this happened because of evidence ABC. Then this happened because of evidence DEF. And then this happened because of evidence G and H. And then give your account of what happened inside the House of Polybius. While everything else is happening outside, this is what's happening inside the House of Polybius. This is why they stayed. This is why they didn't leave. This is why they didn't, this is why they didn't leave later, or maybe this is why they didn't even have the option of leaving. And that brings us to the conclusion of our discussion of the archaeology of the most famous archaeological site of all, Pompeii itself. We're going to leave Rome for the next module, and we're going, well, I'll let it be a surprise what we're going to encounter in the next module, but I can tell you one thing, that I will see you there.